Hey folks, Chris Vandeviver here with Logic Pro Expert. Today's video is a collaborative piece with my colleague Eli, and the task that we gave ourselves was starting with the exact same project and mixing the drums in the project. So we're each mixing individually. I don't know what Eli did, he doesn't know what I'm doing. And we're gonna see, what do two individual mix engineers arrive to in terms of processing decisions and mixing decisions when they're presented with the same drum tracks. So we're gonna take a listen to what I did here in terms of mixing. We'll compare before and after, and then we'll start to explore what I did and why I did it. So let's take a listen to the first couple seconds of this drum performance. Cool. So let's open the mixer, let's select the drum tracks, and we're going to bypass all plugins and routing, so we can hear before, and then we'll hear after again. And again, after. Okay, so we have a sense of what's going on. Now, I do want to point out that the overhead track is a stereo track, but it wasn't originally a stereo track. In fact, it was two separate left and right channels, and we can see there hard pan left and right. But I bounced these together as a stereo file because I don't really like to work on overhead tracks independent of one another. I feel like that there are too many problems that can come up by processing these individually. Instead, I just want to process them as one and the same microphone. Cool. Going back to the mixer, I tried to start out by processing these drums as a whole before I dug into the individual microphones. But what I found is that I didn't really like the results I was getting using the top-down approach. So then I moved forward, tackling each individual mic one at a time, and then using a little bit of processing on the entire drum kit just to glue this kit together. So let's start out with the drum track stack. And I have the graphic EQ. And originally I was playing around with the 16 and 32K lift at the top. Using the tune, you can turn it up all the way to 32K, and it really is fantastic. But what I ended up on was just a tiny, tiny lift at 500 hertz, which I never do, and 250 hertz, 0.5 dB, just a little lift just to kind of firm things up. And really, I'm just after the output drive section. I love the output modeling of these vintage EQs. It just adds a nice texture. After that, we have the compressor on the vintage Opto, 3-to-1 ratio, and it's a pretty fast attack, but honestly, it's only tucking down the snare drum. It's not even touching the kick. Check it out. Cool. Then we have the exciter, and I'm adding just a touch of excitement, 5K and above, and it felt like a nice, it felt nice for adding an assertiveness to the kit. But you gotta be careful with the exciter because it's so easy to go overboard so quickly. And I'm using the first color, but honestly, I didn't even try the second color. And this is a new technique for me. I have Space Designer on the drum bus, adding a touch of reverb, a short room. So if we dig into the presets, small spaces, rooms, and it's the jazz guitar room, which I actually like quite a bit. And it's just adding a little glue to the entire drum kit. So let's hear before and after of this processing. Now moving on to the individual microphones, you're going to see that I pretty much exclusively use the linear EQ for EQing. Now we're dealing with a multi-mic drum kit setup. Each of these individual mics are linked together because they're all recording the same instrument at the same time, but from different perspectives. The reason I use the linear EQ is mainly for high passing, but also, I just don't like using the channel EQ because I feel like it messes with the phase of the instrument, and then you have to pull up gain plugins and constantly invert the phase or polarity. You have to adjust the timing of the individual mics using the sample delay, and it's just more work than I feel like dealing with. So I use the linear EQ for high passing, general boosts and cuts, where I'll have the vintage EQs in a linear phase mode. But for the overheads, we only have a high pass filter, about 69 hertz. And that's because this overhead captured some tom performances, and the toms are right about here, so I don't want to remove them by accident. So it's a pretty low high pass filter for what I typically do. So let's try to identify some tom hits here. So there was one tom. Let's try to find another. Okay, well, we'll probably stumble across one as we keep going here. On top of that, I do have the channel EQ just to remove a couple of frequencies or resonances that were driving me crazy as I was listening. And additionally, the directional mixer, which I didn't intend to use, but I found that the kick drum was kind of smeared from left to right. So I'm using the split mode, crossover at 80 hertz, so right about where that high pass filter is. So I don't know, maybe it's not even doing anything, but I set the spread to 0 to try to bring any leftover low frequencies to the center, just so they're not smeared every time the kick hits. Now for the hi-hat track, my hi-hat is quite quiet, and that's because I generally don't like hi-hat tracks. I know this is blasphemous, but I really don't like hi-hat microphone tracks. They always are so loud and aggressive, so you have to tuck them down a ton, and I feel like they always feel disjointed from the rest of the drum kit. So I'm high-passing to remove anything down at the bottom that we don't need. There is some sort of muddy texture here, right around 500-600 hertz that I was bringing down, and also a resonant frequency that felt aggressive at 570. So let's hear this right now with the hi-hat mic. Let's turn this off and back on. And after. And the compressor is just tucking it down a hair, 4-to-1 ratio, fast attack 3 milliseconds. And it's just, I don't know, just kind of gluing it together for me. After that, we have the ride cymbal, which has next to nothing. It's just a high pass filter, tiny lift in the top end just to kind of reorient the ride cymbal to express that air that I associate with a ride cymbal. And these 3 cymbal microphones are being sent to their own reverb as well. So I have Space Designer with a spring reverb, which is not typical for me either. I took a lot of chances with this, but I just went in the medium spaces and I tried to find something that was kind of add a little more spread in the stereo spectrum in the high end. And you can see with the linear EQ here that I'm rolling off quite a bit. So it's really just focused on the high end. So let's just take a listen to these cymbals. Now you can hear that spring. Okay, with the kick drum and the snare, I did some crazy processing, but I've stumbled across an idea that I like a lot, and it's using Amp Designer without any sort of cabinet emulation, just a head to tonally shape the snare and the kick. And what it bestows to the snare and kick is an immediate tonal shift, so you don't have to work very hard to get your snare kick brighter or more low-end heavy or whatever you need. And plus the amp head sort of acts like a compressor. You have gain, so you can drive that up and add a little grit. I don't know, I feel like it works really well. So for the kick drum, I have a noise gate lightly tucking down. You can see the reduction is not at 100%. It's at -20, just a lightly tucked down like an expander would. Additionally, I have a compressor with the Studio VCA, which I love to use for kick drums. The attack is pretty fast for a kick drum. I normally wouldn't do this, but I'm just trying to rein in the low end of the kick. It's not low end heavy, but when you include Amp Designer, things get a little crazy, and so I had to rein things back a hair. After that, we have a linear EQ that's tucking around 84 hertz. And after Amp Designer, a linear EQ that's also tucking right around there. Because without these EQs, the kick drum sounds pretty aggressive with Amp Designer. And I only noticed this, honestly, right before filming this video when I was listening on my iMac speakers. So it's always good to have that drop box to listen to, because those things will start to freak out very quickly if any frequency is a little too prominent. With Amp Designer, I find that you can't use too many of the heads when it comes to processing kick or drum, but I really like a lot of these clean Fender amps right at the top here, and they get crunchy too. And really, I don't know, I just have a tiny bit of treble and presence boosted, tiny bit of mid, left the bass at 5. Gain, just pushing it enough that it starts to feel like that the kick is starting to compress, but not getting crazy with distortion. So both before and after, let's just remove all this and hear it. And after. Cool, and with the snare, I have an actual expander just to kind of push down some of the cymbal activity while dredging up the snare hits. A linear EQ, rolling off, high passing. The channel EQ is There was a ring in the snare that was very difficult to handle. And normally I would use like a dynamic EQ like the FabFilter Pro Q3 or Soothe from Oak Sound to tuck these things down. But the goal was to only use Logic plugins. So I'm doing some insane EQing around this resonance to try to tuck it down. But what I found was the snare signal almost sounded like it was modulating when it was rubbing against the other drum tracks. And that's what brought about Amp Designer in the first place on the snare, is that it was more or less trying to disguise perhaps the mangling that I was doing to this snare drum. So let's hear without this channel EQ. So the channel EQ is sucking out some resonances. The console EQ is adding that drive, tucking down some mid-range stuff, boosting the high end just to give it a little more presence. The compressor is the vintage FET just to add some aggression to the snare drum, and then the Amp Designer track. So let's hear before and after. And with the Amp Designer track, I actually have some reverb using the warm reverb. And you can see that the EQ section is pretty much just all set at 12 o'clock. The presence is the only thing that's boosted. And both the kick and the snare are being sent to a drum crush channel. Using the linear EQ, I had to roll off some of that craziness of the kick's low end, especially with my processing involved here. And then I'm using Distortion 2, which I love. I love this plugin for adding just nastiness and grit to different tracks. And on top of that, I have the Fat Effects, and that's adding a healthy dose of compression. So if we just listen to this channel here, without the linear EQ, it's just a little too much. So let's back it up. And then the snare is being sent to its own reverb as well, Space Designer. Again, with a spring reverb. I normally don't ever use this many spring reverbs, but here we are. Linear EQ rolling off the low end, also tucking down some of the high end so it's not too in your face, and a compressor just to even things out. So if we listen to both of these together and remove the snare verb and the drum crush, actually, let's just hear the drum kit. Here we go. And there we have it. That's the drum processing as quick as I could. So I hope that was helpful for you. Once again, I'm Chris Vandeviver with Logic Pro Expert.